So, Chris, before we dig into it,
Yes,
the expectation, our mission is to what? To bring forth several proposals?
it's up to us to bring forward either one proposal or several, or
Okay,
one proposal with variations. So my thinking is that we'll probably put forth at least 2 or 3 proposals because we don't know what the pricing is per se to dredge 35,000 cubic yards or 50 or 75 or whatever. So if we want to put that together, I think that we need to figure out what is the right amount, what is the cost, where do we put it? Do we keep some within the pond? So some of those things are what I'm thinking about anyways.
so are we operating at a cost constraint here, or are we putting that aside for the moment and just coming up with a proposal, then we'll figure out what the costs are? Is that?
Correct. We're putting the cost aside for the moment and coming up with our plans.
So I think you captured sort of how much to dredge, where to dispose, the other parameters, where to dredge, right?
Correct.
Then so it's how much and where and where to dispose.
Right.
Is how to dredge one of the parameters, the dredging method?
I
Although
think
the dry dredging was ruled out by the consultants when this was initially looked at, because it would not be, it would be prohibitively difficult to have the pond be dry enough that you could get equipment in there. So hydraulic dredge was identified as the appropriate way to dredge the pond, and that was in the dredging feasibility study.
so. Is that what was in the first proposal, Delia, for the 35,000?
Yeah, it's a hydraulic dredge. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so that part is fixed. The method is hydraulic dredging.
I would say so.
Okay.
I think so, unless somebody else has any other comments about that.
It's likely the most cost effective, but I would say, Paul, if that was something you really wanted to compare, like doing like mechanical dredging, I mean, that would be something we would have to consider through this group.
Well, I think if we know that there is a lower cost option associated with the methodology, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree.
Just the last point is that Bruce, you are here, so we just took attendance. So the fact that you're here.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Excellent.
I had a quick question about the dredging. So sort of the dry dredging, one of the things that plays out with dry dredging, sort of depending on not being able to get into the pond, would be looking at sort of doing it mechanically on the water, which would also be extremely cost prohibitive. And, basically looking at that by barge or small barge. So I think that, those things have to be taken into consideration with that. And then I'll go back to the other dredging is sort of the archaeological pieces of it, because that land was, before it was probably untouched before it was filled with water. So we may not have an archaeological assessment of that land underneath, and the caution of when we're sucking it out, really how to keep that in mind.
Okay. Okay, good to know.
I want to go back to the purpose of dredging. I think we know, but I want to make sure it's set in my mind. In my mind, there's two reasons to dredge. One is to increase the depth in the pond so the plants can't grow, so the invasive plant issue. The other one is a water quality related issue, right? Are there any other?
Well, so when you say a water quality issue, can you clarify what you mean by that?
Well, this has been floating around for a while. So my understanding is that a decent part of the nutrient input to the overlying water comes from the sediment. And not that there is an inflow and not that there isn't septic, but I've yet to see any evidence that the sediment transport from the sediment to the overlying water is not the A major, if not the major transport. So if you reduce the amount of nutrients in the sediments, you would reduce the amount of nutrients to the water column, and the water quality would be affected. So that in my mind is a linkage between the, and
I guess I would suggest that, you know, we have so much sediment in that pond that I'm not sure that it matters where it comes from. I mean, it's not like it's a toxin like mercury or something like that, right? That it needs to be gotten rid of. It's just, it's a problem because it causes this excessive weed growth and unlimited amounts of phosphorus in the pond, whether it's in the sediments or coming from outside of the system, have contributed to that condition. But I don't think it's necessarily something that we, you know, if we had like cyanobacteria blooms like we did at White Pond that were driven by high phosphorus, then I think you would want to understand where that's coming from so you could address it. But since we don't have that issue and we already know we've got, you know, excessive aquatic weed growth, that's the issue I think that we need to deal with. I don't think that understanding whether it's, you know, internal loading or external inputs of phosphorus matters to us.
So quick question. That if I may.
just to follow up, I'm sorry, just to follow up on it. I think we need to agree on that. My understanding was that eutrophication, which is more than just plant growth, right? It says nutrients, it's plant growth, but it's dissolved oxygen. It's the whole ecology of the pond, as such as plants. That was one of the central issues in dredging. So the water quality part. So you're not saying to take water quality goal off the
I'm
table.
just saying, so I'm saying that the purpose of dredging would be to improve the area in which the dredging occurs. You're not going to reduce the amount of phosphorus, nor would that be a goal of dredging. You just want to get it deep enough. Or two things, you want to be able to remove those aquatic invasives, and then you want it to be deep enough in that dredged area that you don't further contribute because you don't have the ability for sunlight to get down to the bottom to keep exacerbating the problem. The phosphorus is not an intention. That's not a goal of a dredging project. Phosphorus removal.
Okay, so improvement of water quality per se is not a goal. Improvement of water quality so that it retards or eliminates plant growth
Right.
is the objective. Okay, that was never clear. If that's, you know, is that something we all agree on?
I would probably just say that removal of accumulated excess phosphorus that's been accumulating in sediments that are 100, 200 years old is definitely a benefit of dredging. I mean, it's stored in the sediments. So we remove it through dredging. That does remove a lot of that phosphorus that's contributing to excessive plant growth. So that
Right.
dredging is not done. Dredging is done to remove sediment, so it might be like a secondary benefit in terms of just what we're trying to accomplish. But to say there won't be a benefit, it might be if that's what's being said. I don't know if that's.
No, I'm not saying that.
clarify.
I completely agree that if you're taking the sediment out, the sediment is loaded with phosphorus. You are getting rid of some of the phosphorus in the system. It's just not it's not the primary goal, but it's a secondary for sure.
So it doesn't matter how much phosphorus we remove from the sediments. So you're saying we can remove some, but it really doesn't matter how much. Because, you know, if we're only going to dredge 4% of the area, you're not removing much phosphorus, you're removing a little bit. You know, if you remove 100% of the sediments, that's one. So I think I'm trying to, if we agree that sediment phosphorus removal is an ancillary benefit, but it's not the focus, then that puts us in, I think, in a simpler direction, I think.
And I would suggest that is the case. Denise, I see that you have your hand raised. We have a public comments session on the agenda at the end of the meeting. So we'll get to that in a little bit.
So I have a quick question with that. So the depth of the banks that will surface around the outside edge, because that seems to, you know, that's always where the invasive seems to start. It's sort of that edge because of the light saturation. So we're talking about pulling the sediment more heavily there and creating a deeper, almost trench along the outside borders of the pond.
So that had not been the intention, and I can share my screen to show you where those original dredge locations had been proposed. And I'll do that as we're talking. Maybe we
Okay.
can-
Yeah, that was just part of the concern. It's like, so you're talking about, you're talking about sort of deeper bankings on the side, basically, if you're pulling that out, because I know that when we are out looking at where the sort of the spread starts, it always starts closer to the edge because of light saturation. On the sort of the slope upward, the upward slope, starting here and then sort of working its way down until it gets to a place where there's no light saturation through the water to give it what it needs to grow. So that means this would have to come down here, which then creates a deeper banking here on the outside edge of the water. So you're now looking at a pond that has a very deep edge.
I would say typical dredge plan wouldn't really do that. It would maintain kind of existing slopes for a certain amount out and then focus on deepening more towards the away from the shoreline. There's other things you can do to manage invasive plants on the edges that isn't the same as dredging, say, invasive species control specifically, but using other methods.
Right, but I would think that the idea of dredging is also thinking about, I mean, if we're not thinking just about phosphorus, we're also thinking about sort of that invasive species that I know you guys have done a lot of work in the last few weeks around. And the piece of that, thinking of that is like, what is the depth around sort of where that outside border, just say water chestnuts is, where light saturation is coming through? Because doesn't that create, and just, so I always like to play devil's advocate, sort of like public safety on sort of depth of water, right close to the edge where people are launching in or getting into the water or using it for swimming or docks or whatever. And I think that has an effect on how we're thinking about it for access points as well.
So
That's
this is
true. I
this
think
is
we
the
might
next-
want to focus just initially, maybe on the first plan or the original plan. And because that shows a couple of areas where the dredging was to occur. And then, I don't know where, improving the Commonwealth Avenue access comes into play with this as well. That definitely, I think, should be a part of it. It's just, is that part of the dredging? Is that part of another portion? But
The recreational improvement, I think.
right, and the access to the pond.
Delia, can we go back here? So this is the original plan. What?
So
So
this
when I
is
look
the
at
dredging
this,
feasibility. It was further advanced into the permit, so it's slightly different between this 2018 and what was put out to bid in 22. But this
Right.
is essentially what was this is the two dredging areas.
so why are these two dredging areas? So the invasive aquatic plant issue that clogs up the pond is much more widespread than these two areas, correct?
Yes, right. So, part of what is going to drive any project is cost. So, these two areas were selected because we felt like this would be, there's a lot of invasives in here. There's a lot of wanting to access from the Commonwealth. And then there was, the recently acquired Giroux parcel being able to provide access from there into not a mucky mess. So those were the reasons that those two areas were selected. And that they would maintain their, ability to be, relatively good for, a period of time.
So at the beginning of this discussion, I think we agreed for the moment that cost would not be a constraint.
Yeah.
It may end up being a constraint.
Yeah.
So that in that plan, cost was a constraint, right? We didn't know, you didn't know what the cost was going to be till you got the bid, but in your
No,
mind,
but we knew that dredging the entire pond would be cost prohibitive. It's just
Right.
not, yeah. That was never considered because it would have been far too expensive. But you're right, from our subgroup standpoint, we're looking at this without considering cost. So we can look at the 35,000 yards. We can look at a, a larger number. I think everybody agreed in the task force that the 14,000 was not an acceptable number. That was too low.
No, I would recommend that, excuse me, that the 35,000 be probably a minimal amount to
Yeah,
start with anyways.
Well, I think we want to just compare disposal, using a different disposal plan just to see how those costs differ as just a good baseline, and then move on from there to start comparing things equally.
Right.
And
Let
what
me-
about in pond sediment location?
So I guess I have another question. So we're looking at that area to put the dredge between Route 2 and the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, right? Somewhat near the prison cemetery. So I guess a question I have would be, how much sediment can fit there?
Right. Okay. Let me just pull that up for people to see. So we're talking about, oops. Talking about this area here, Chris.
Right.
Okay. And Jeff, maybe, if we had initially, after the bid came in, we had looked at this for the 35,000 yards. And do we want to come up with numbers? I mean, what, 100,000? I mean, Chris, you mentioned there was a couple other numbers that you think we should be thinking.
I mean, I just threw numbers out there. I just think that we should look at, 2 or 3 other quantities as well. I mean, and so based on that, one of the questions I have is how much dredge could fit there?
Mhm.
I mean, and I think that may have a lot to do with how much we could dredge if we have a location for it before we start putting it in pond or leaving some of it in pond.
What's the area, you point to a general area, is there a constraint in how much of that area that we're looking at can be?
I'm hoping that Jeff might have some insight into that.
That area is currently not farmed, and the reason was because of the Route 2 Rotary project at the time. You'll notice that if you're on the site, you'll notice there's a monitoring well right about where Dale's mouse was.
Oh, over here?
No, it's in front of the cemetery. Closer to,
Oh,
yeah,
in here?
closer to Route 2. If you go north, it's up in that area.
Okay.
So
So
you
what does that
have to
mean?
look at what the current elevation grades are in that area in relationship to the existing Route 2 elevation and the rail trail elevations, because you want to be below that. And I'm sure at some point we'd have to run that by Mass DOT, because they may resurrect the Route 2 rotary at some point.
Is that our only disposal area option?
No, we had identified there are some old sand filter beds by the wastewater treatment plant, which is on the other side of the facility. Not where the solar panels are, but there's roughly 6 beds there. And I thought we had calculated that was maybe about a third of the 35,000 cubic yards. But what I'm hearing now is that the town, obviously they're interested in taking over the wastewater plant so they could do building in West Concord. But they were looking at potentially doing a ground discharge versus a surface water discharge, which the plant currently has. So if they did that, they would utilize not only those vacant 6 beds, but also the beds where the solar panels are. So we'd have to confirm that with the town if that's their intention once they finally take over the plant.
So that means that that space is not available then, correct? Or potentially?
Potentially, yeah. You'd have to see what the town plan for that area is.
Isn't there an additional or an increased expense anyways when moving dredge material across a road? Is that true, or is that just something that it's in my mind?
There's trucks.
It's the distance that you have to carry it.
If you truck it, that alone is more expensive, but if it's hydraulically dredged, you can just run a pipeline across a road. And you just put speed bumps over it for cars, essentially, but people, yeah, they do some pretty wild things with dredging projects. I think you can cross a road like that.
So you can basically pump it over there.
Yeah, you just pump it.
Are you talking about across Commonwealth Ave or to go to the
Yeah, I think
wastewater treatment beds? Yeah.
Yeah,
Because I think that would be possible. I'm not sure that DOT would allow that to go over Route 2.
yeah, and I think for a highway that's probably a non-starter, but a smaller road like Comm, I think that's probably easier to pull off.
So given that the whole MCI property and the whole Route 2 improvement is in flux and unknown, can we still, I mean, conceptually plan on disposing dredge material in that area next to the cemetery, or is that wholly dependent on the whole Route 2 rotary plan?
That area is more leaned towards the what the Route 2 Mass DOT plans on doing for that area. In
Do they
their
even have
their last proposal, they actually had the exit off ramp for that Route 2 going through the cemetery. They didn't realize the cemetery was there. So I'm sure that's going to change now, especially now since Concord is closed. There would be some revisions.
So now if we were to put dredge material there, and I think that our belief is that it's a lot of sand and that it's good material, would that be a problem?
Problem for the Route 2?
For the Mass DOT, yeah, for Route 2, I mean, who knows?
So are you saying that using it for what, Chris?
I mean, using it to could we still use that for dredge material, even though there is potential for that to be part of the new Route 2, whatever, off ramp or Route 2, or is that, I mean, it's supposedly good material, so.
So good material for what though? Because I mean, it is fine sands and organics. There's no coarse or very little coarse. They're very small grains. It's like beach sands in the underlying below the organics. So what is it that, maybe that's a question we need to answer. What is the material suitable for?
But they wouldn't use it for roadway construction because it's more classified as the sandy loam. So they potentially could use it for grading off-roadway areas.
So I guess my question is, if we were able to put it there, would that be a problem for the Mass DOT? Or not?
I think we simply don't know. I mean, this whole Route 2 planning and MCI, I think it's, for us to propose a disposal area, I think is highly uncertain. And to come up with a plan that locates it there is a plan, we don't know if we can implement that plan.
Couldn't that be a plan with further information needed? I mean, that's the other thing, is we can have plans that have further information needed and then gather that or garner that information so that we can actually have especially if we're looking at 2 or 3 different plans.
Yeah. Well, let's say, I'm just speculating here, that the whole Route 2 plan construction is what, 6 years off? 3? Whatever, it's not gonna happen right away. So that would mean that any dredging is not gonna happen within the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years because of the uncertainty in that. I'm just guessing here, but I mean, it's nothing we can plan on. So dredging is a long-term plan. It's not something that's gonna happen disposal in that area is a long-term plan.
Right.
And is that what we are coming up with, a long-term dredging plan, or is it something? I know Delia, you didn't start out like that. We want to get the dredging underway, but this banking on either of these two disposal areas seems like speculative and at best a long-term plan.
So let me ask this. I mean, I think that's right, Paul. I think it is a long term, but is there value to understanding what the cost of dredging is, even if we don't know? Like if we had a cost prepared for that 35,000 yards at the Rotary, even though we don't know what DOT is going to think about that. And I think we can imagine what they're going to think. I don't know. But is there value to getting a cost so that we can understand whether dredging is feasible from a financial aspect?
We already have the permits for that, right?
Essentially, I mean, yeah, I don't think there would be a change because only if, I mean, there might be a slight change because you might be able to just pipe instead of doing the dewatering. And then once it's dewatered, then you truck it somewhere else, you might be able to do a direct, hydraulic discharge to that site. So there might be a slight modification, but I don't think it's major.
So, I mean, because you've said in the past that the permitting process is what takes a lot of time, and if we already have the permits in place, then this might not necessarily, Paul, be a long-term project.
Well, do we have the permits in place for disposal at that area? Or just for the
I don't
dredging?
think that they would, there might need to be an amendment because the methodology changes from the dewatering location now sort of getting relocated. So let me just pull up the map again. Sorry. So the initial plan had the pond was going to be dredged and it was going to be piped over to a dewatering area here. And that field is farmed. And because of that, we needed to use the geotubes so that DOC was able to get that land back into farming, without having it wait, out a whole season. It's going to be done over the winter. And then it was going to be trucked from here over to the prison here. But so if you change this now and have the pipe run across here, you might need a permit modification. I don't know. I mean, but if you did, I don't think it's a huge lift. But I think I'm just curious whether people think there's value in getting that cost, basically, of doing a disposal at an unrestricted location. So at least we know what cost we're talking about, because, we had the construction cost estimate the same month that the bid went out come in at 3 million. And we had about 3 million. We were going to have to get a little bit more. But then the one bid, and I think it was a high bid too, but I don't think it was a $3 million bid. And I think would be helpful to understand, are we talking, is it 4 million or is it 6 million? Because those numbers might matter to people.
Yeah, well, it could be 2 million. So yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
worth pursuing, getting some kind of relative comparison to compare hydraulic dredging and disposal and not using trucks to transport the material, because there are drastically different costs to do either method.
Right.
I agree. I think it's great. So the $3 million gorilla, right? We really need to know as a baseline. Call the 35,000 cubic yards a baseline. With the different disposal area, the most efficient method, call that a baseline. And we can take it from there. Now,
right.
Putting aside the constraint about Route 2 in that whole area, we still have how much dredge material could go there, even if we could put it there.
Right.
It's 35, is it capped at 35,000? Could it go up to 100,000?
No, I mean, so at 35,000, I think it was, we can figure this out. It was about 1.75 acres. And it was from 15 to 25 feet in height.
Wow.
So it was about a football field long. This was for the 35,000 acres.
Cubic yards.
Right, so that was about 30,000 yards. No, less, yeah, about 30,000 yards.
And how big is that area that we were looking at?
Um,
Can you measure that on the GIS?
yep. So if we said, I think it stops here, right? Or can I go further south, Jeff?
I would go maybe on the other side of that tree line that's on Route 2.
Here?
Yeah,
Okay.
then straight
Start
across.
here
Yep,
and go down, how far?
I'd go right to the rail trail.
Oh, you could go this far.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Okay, like this?
yep.
So 241954.
Hmm, 42,000.
That's about 5.5 acres.
That's a pretty good size.
Yeah,
Yep.
And
just
sorry,
by
which is the,
observing that I think that field's a little, it's in a bit of a depression area. If I remember correctly, it isn't quite level with Route 2, so you do have some land to give there before you become level with Route 2. Just as a observation that I'm thinking about.
I think you're in like the 4 or 5 foot depression
Yeah,
range.
that sounds about right.
But then that's not really a permanent, possibly not a permanent location either.
Well,
So
it gotta keep in mind that this acreage that is currently shown is under the care and control of the Department of Corrections.
Right,
So Mass DOT does not own that land.
okay,
So if we were to deposit that dredging material there, and then they decided to revive the Route 2 rotary project, if they needed to do something in that area as part of that project design, they would have to include that within that design.
okay, because it would already be there.
Right.
So how would that work, Jeff? Would DOC ask DOT first what they felt about that, or would it just be,
I would probably reach out to them, just oh, by the way, we're
yeah. Oops. Yeah,
depositing material there.
right. Okay,
so go back to, you said that the 35,000 cubic yards would take up, you said 1.5 acre?
I think it was 1.75 acres.
Okay, so at least conceptually, that area could take maybe 3 times the amount, maybe,
Mhm.
maybe 100,000. So I'm just thinking in our various proposals, Christine, maybe 35,000 is the sort of minimum, and then 100,000 is the conceivably possible. What do we call it?
Maximum.
So 3 times the amount is 110,000 cubic yards.
Sounds like it's worth looking into. I mean,
Yeah,
if we
well,
find,
back to your point, Delia, getting the cost, the baseline cost for, you know, this hydraulic dredging and that disposal area for 35,000. That'll go a long way to seeing what we can propose here.
I think we
Whether,
have our first proposal.
was that?
I
good,
think we have our first proposal.
good, we love it.
I guess I wanted to follow up with Jeff on that. You told us about the monitoring well. Do you know is that installed and owned by the DOC?
It's not, they had put that in under the initial design, Mass DOT. They wanted to test water quality in that area.
Okay.
And I
is
think that has to relate to storm drainage now can't go off-site. They prefer to have it on-site disposal of stormwater. So they create retention ponds. So I think they were just checking what the groundwater level was in that area. That's why they put that well in.
That's likely something we need to maintain then, is that sounds like?
But again, you have to stay below the Route 2 elevation and the rail trail elevation. So that height difference from what's existing there is going to be your guide as to how much material you could place there.
Oh, I missed that. So are you saying that if it's a 5-foot differential between Route 2 and the fields, that it could come up 5 feet? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, potentially could come up almost to the 5-foot. Whatever that road elevation, you need to be below that. Same thing on the rail trail side. You need to be below that.
So
that-
that's,
The average height elevation would need to be below that, over that 5.5 acres.
and that would be so that DOT could still accomplish whatever improvements they see with
Yeah.
Route 2.
And yeah, I mean, at this point, we don't know what they're planning to do on Route 2. I think with the closing of Concord, their original plan is out the window, and I'm sure they'll come up with something eventually. But I think you're quite a ways away from that at this point.
Right. So can we just go back then? I didn't realize that. So we can't have a 25-foot high mount that we could have had on the other side of the prison. We can be
Yeah.
up to, we can be just below the Route 2 grade.
Yeah, and the primary reason is runoff. You don't want to flood out Route 2 at that location.
No. Well, would we be able to go all the way over here? I know it rises up a little bit as you're moving in this direction, but would this be an area that could also be considered for disposal?
Potentially, but there's an access road for the farmer that you can see at the top of that.
Yeah.
Right next, so he has to maintain that, and I think that's at that current field level, elevation wise.
It's pretty level here. That's what I think too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that's something that we could maybe formulate into a proposal to have this area looked at with those parameters. And maybe that gets us to our number of how much material, like if that's our disposal location. That's
Yeah,
what the number is.
I think that has to be surveyed to figure out just
It would.
what since the elevations are different between the rail trail and Route 2, it's like the volume of that area needs to be calculated.
Right.
Do we have somebody who could calculate that area?
Well, we would have to
Volume?
pay somebody to go out and survey it and develop a plan.
Yeah.
But that's, I mentioned at the last meeting that we're looking to modify EA's contract so that it can line up with some of the things that the task force is looking at. So this could be one thing that we could ask them to, to look at. There's a cost associated with it, obviously, but
I would
Yeah,
think, I would think there's LiDAR data that's been collected. We could probably do a pretty quick, accurate estimate for volumes and not have to do an actual survey at this point, just to get us in the ballpark.
I think that's true that you could get LiDAR information, but then if you want to get a cost estimate from that, I think it's going to be challenging, we can look at that and see what a construction cost estimating firm would want.
Yeah, LiDAR can be pretty accurate. That's all. I think it's worth looking into.
Sure.
So I think those are we've hit on two key pieces of information. One is the cost, and one is I'll call it the survey or just the capacity of that area.
Right.
At this point, Delia, are there any other disposal area options that are feasible and the realm of cost, reasonableness?
Not that I'm aware of.
So we had talked initially about leaving some of the dredge in pond. Was that because of location or it seemed like a good thing to do?
So the reason that I asked the consultant to look at that when we got that high bid was because the cost of trucking and disposal was so high. So if you left the sediment in the pond and created wetland shelves, like we were gonna do with the 5,000 yards, if you just did more of that, theoretically, you could also reduce, you would not have the same cost. You wouldn't have those dewatering and then disposal, and the trucking costs. You would not have that. You would have other costs where you would need to make sure that the material that you moved, remains where you put it. But that's, that would be feasible. And that was, so the 14,000, and I wish we hadn't done this, but that was a decision that I made at the time, was that knowing we had 3 million, to back into that number, which is where we got that 14,000 yards. So that's where that number came from. But, you could do 35 and, you could do 100, but if the more that you fill, the more that you move into other areas of the pond, the less ponds you have.
Right.
Right, so
Can
you're,
you put the map back up there?
sure.
So what was the thinking of where that in pond disposal might? I don't know how much
So-
thinking.
Initially, we had looked at both the southwestern and the northwestern coves. And this one just seemed better because, this is deep. This is the one deep hole in the pond. So it didn't make sense after we thought about it to place material into the one deep area. And so that's where it became looking at filling in this, which is already, by the end of, July, this is already, it's impassable. All of this is just, so you can create wetlands within the ponds, right? So you can bring in enough material that you would still have the elevation of, these areas, but you cannot create uplands because you are now in complete conflict with the Wetlands Protection Act. So you could move material up to a certain elevation, still remaining wetlands, and you would have, good bordering vegetated wetlands. And you could do more than, 14,000 with something like this. You could probably fill all of this. Well, obviously not here, but so there's more material that could go in, but I think 100,000 yards, you're looking at filling in other areas that are, now where are you going to put all that stuff? You're really
think-
starting to lose the pond.
I think the goal is to maximize placement in the ag field as much as possible, and then we figure out what's left and consider putting in pond placement with what's left. So we're not putting 100,000 potentially in the pond.
I agree, you could split that up. So you have a slightly smaller pond, but you still have a pond.
Yeah, and I keep saying, the alternative is dam removal, and that whole area is going to become upland anyways. So this would be like a good compromise to try to, if we're going to dedicate an area to the pond that might not be open water anymore, that's a pretty small area to, with the hope of preserving the rest of the open water areas for long-term use.
So can I go back to the phosphorus discussion? So I remember that there have been some discussion about in pond placement, and others have made the observation that, well, then you're not really removing the nutrients from the pond, you're just putting it somewhere else and they can leach back in the pond. But if indeed our earlier discussion points to the fact that that's a secondary or ancillary benefit, then it really doesn't matter that, that it might leach back into the pond, right?
There's
Yeah,
other things that could be done to control invasives and other than dredging. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, that's right, Paul. It's not
Yeah.
going to matter.
That sounds like a sensible construct, put as much as you can next to Route 2 and then fill in other areas, assuming you go up to 100,000. So, you know, there are lots of variables in motion here.
Mhm.
Right, I think you're right. It makes sense to figure out how much will fit in that 4 to 5, what is it, 4 to 5 acres there.
And maybe more. If it
5.5
goes
acres.
further
right.
west, it might be a little bit more. I think there's less, depth.
Right,
Might be a little bit. It's a
so
foot.
that would be interesting to understand that, because that will give us a sense of how to proceed as well.
Yep.
Do we agree with the principle that the more we can dredge, the better?
Yes, I think we do.
Okay.
So if we change like the amount of, like anything about the dredging that changes will require changes to the permits.
So what does that mean, Delia? Does that mean that if we change the quantity, then do you have to change all the permits or amend them?
It might be an amendment. I think it, is a conversation with the regulators, but it would be Army Corps, it would be DEP Chapter 91, it would be DEP Water Quality, CERT, and it would be NRC. And I think NRC would be the easiest. It's a conversation to have, at what point, if you doubled it or if you tripled it, does that require a new filing? Or is it all going to be an amendment?
And just from my understanding, how long does that process take? About?
The Chapter 91 is probably the lengthiest, and it can be a year.
Okay.
So these permits have an expiration. So what would be the general timeline for all those permits for their expiration?
3 to 5 years.
So it doesn't sound like the permitting process is a constraint either. And so they have to deal with.
I don't think I mean, it's just onerous, but I don't think it's, it's expensive. I mean, I think it was, $60,000 or $75,000 to go through those 4 permit processes. But that included final design, so which we would also still need to do again because the designs would change.
But it wouldn't be a far reach because it's just basically the increase in material, so this similar
Right.
process, and then just changing the numbers for the amount of material.
Mhm.
And I do believe that there is a percentage increase, but it's definitely not from 35 to 100. It's a completely different process.
But the regulators care whether there's in-pond disposal or outside of pond disposal as far as permitting decision?
From there will be questions on, flood capacity if that changes, and that would have to be analyzed. And then it was kind of an odd pushback with, there's the one high hit of arsenic in the pond, and one of the regulators had a real issue with us moving that from one part of the pond to the other, which I never understood because it's already in the ponds, but it was a problem to use that for the wetland shelf creation. So we ended up just, disposing of it in the
Has
plant.
that arsenic number ever been confirmed?
Well, it was tested and found it was one high hit. And so everything would have to, that's the other thing is those sediment samples have now expired. So any changes to the permits, you'd need to do that sediment sampling again. And we would have tested the sediments, I mean, Jeff and I had talked about this. I mean, before the prison accepted any material that would have had to have been tested. So, I mean, arsenic is a naturally occurring metal. So
Yeah, it is.
it's not the most worrisome of what's out there.
Mhm. Mhm. It sounds like we have a plan.
Yeah.
So is the first thing that we need to do though, is that, do we need to reach out to the Department of Corrections, Jeff, and find out if we can still utilize that property?
Yes, you can. That's already a given. And that's,
Good.
that land
Property's available.
Concord closure.
Perfect. So that's a
Yeah,
given, so.
So I
So
think
it's a
what
deep-
our action items are, and I think it makes sense to start with the LiDAR topography to figure out what the volume is
Yeah,
and then, you know, have somebody run some calcs on what that volume would look like.
okay.
Do the costs, Keith, tend to be linear? So could we take a 35,000 cubic cost and, you know, triple it if it went up to 105,000, or is there some? How do we think about the cost, or do we need separate cost estimates for different volumes?
I think you can. Oh, that's a good question, and I think it depends, you know, I mean, what sort of stabilization measures you might need might
Yeah.
change. The time of how long it would take, you know, between mobilization and demob, that might drive up, that would not necessarily be linear. I'm not sure, but I think the first thing would be to find out what volume could even be put there, see if that's even close to what we're, you know,
Right,
what if it's not 35,000 yards?
right.
Based on previous discussions, I would just be cautious of maybe estimating linear ramp ups for costs. Just I think people think there's too many assumptions being made, so we might need to actually price out different quantities separately.
Well, especially if the higher volume required to split up the disposal, one in pond and one with,
Yeah, it's more complicated, right?
And
So
we
I
don't
guess-
have, right, that would be much more complicated, splitting it up like that.
so I guess it sounds like the first two steps are figure out how much that area can hold. At the same time, try to get cost estimate of the 35,000 cubic yards with the assumption that it could all go on that area.
Right.
You know, that we could do those in parallel, I guess.
I think, um, it would make sense for us to get that estimate and then come back together as a group to talk about that number and then what the next steps are. Cause it's an unknown to me, like if it can accept 50,000 yards or, you know, 20, I think it's a different conversation. So I think we should take one step at a time.
Okay.
And I think maybe everybody, maybe not, but Toby sent out an email today and we are able to meet. I confirmed with the town clerk that we can meet in our subgroups at the regular task force meetings. So we're figuring out the logistics of that, but we'll be able to meet as our group when we meet on the 13th.
But that would be an in-person meeting, wouldn't be a Zoom meeting, right?
So we're gonna try to do breakout rooms for Zoom. We'll do both in person and Zoom. I'm a little
Well,
nervous about it, I know.
That'd be great.
Yep.
We'll include you, Paul.
Oh, yeah, because you won't be back, Paul, right?
Not for the next meeting, no. not
Okay,
for-
well, yeah, so yeah, we're gonna have the breakout room.
But we may need to bring multiple laptops to pull that off.
Yeah. Multiple laptops, multiple owls.
no, no.
Wow.
Good start.
Hmm?
A good start.
Yeah,
Cool. So I guess now the question becomes, who is gonna do that? Is it,
so I can reach out to EA and see. They would have to develop a proposal to do this work. Trying to think if there's a faster way to do it, but I mean, we have them under contract and we can modify their contract, so it's the most, I think, efficient. But I think I have a meeting with them on Monday, the 12th. I can reach out to them before then. And just see if they can get us a cost or, using that entire fields. And using LiDAR, and whether they think that would be adequate to give to a construction cost estimating firm. To develop a realistic cost.
I think one last question. You can go back to the map of the 35,000
Sure.
cubic yards. My question is, if we were to think of 100,000 cubic yards, which additional areas? We have time to think about this. I'm just wondering what the initial thoughts are. Because you have the two areas, right? You have the north next to Jerome, and you have the south area. And what other areas would you dredge?
Oh, which areas would you dredge?
Yeah, the dredge, if you want to go, because you have the dredging diagram that you had from the,
Oh,
put-
let me see if I have that. I'm sorry, I think I closed that, Paul, but I can find it.
Well, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering if, is that it might be worth looking into if this construction cost estimating firm, if they would use like a general volume calculation and this general plan for placing it in that field, starting at 35,000, I mean, that may be enough for them to work out some of the actual cost estimates using like a plan put together by EA. I guess I'm just a little leery of EA being impartial enough to really give us a market price. I think the construction cost estimating firm that's like more like a third party relationship might be.
They wouldn't, so EA is under contract to do design. They would not be doing the construction. I would go out to a construction cost estimating firm. Do you have an issue with them doing the design?
No, I thought I heard you say EA might do a cost estimate to do the 35,000.
No, we would go out to a construction cost estimate.
Okay. Yeah, I'm totally fine having them do the design. Yeah.
So if this is the two areas that comprise the 35,000, it seems to me if you triple that, it almost cover a big part of the pond.
I mean, you could. I think you would sort of look in these areas because it's pretty, this is flows quite nicely, here. I don't think you want to go much further into here because it's just not going to be beneficial, but certainly like something like this that might maybe over
So
here.
basically connecting those two areas.
Mhm. Mhm.
That'd be a great plan. Pull it off.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, looks good. What else do we need to? What other issues?
That big one, the big one is that volume. What are we going to be able to hold in that 5 point whatever acres?
Right.
Especially making sure that slope meets, because that's going to be a sloping that meets what DOT and not come above higher. And then we also need to know is like, do they want us 6 inches below? They want us a foot below? All of those things sort of matter in sort
Mhm.
of understanding when we get down towards the Route 2 side of that land. I actually worked with DOT in New Mexico, and those were always the issues around grade. It's like we had to have a 6-inch drop off, and then we had to have another 4 feet slope. But that was based on anywhere near water versus anywhere near solid land. So we
Okay.
started to look at those pieces that, and those were just the standards they used based on erosion in New Mexico. So a lot of that's sort of the formula they're going to use for their erosion in Massachusetts or in the area or the zone or district, whatever they're doing. And I'm guessing they do use the core a lot more for those kinds of things here than they did in New Mexico. Would that be true, Keith? You work with them a lot on that?
Yeah, I'm not in the permitting
Okay.
groups. I don't have a lot of firsthand knowledge, unfortunately, on that.
Yeah, because I think that it's that whole grading, because that's exactly it. They don't want it to be coming down too fast, so it has to be, the graduation has to be, and the gradient has to be exactly how they want it, which of course then fills in those spaces differently. But I mean, I think the majority of that material may fit in that area. It's just a matter of what they're looking for, gradient and slope and height at the base.
Okay.
So I'm just looking at and taking some notes here, and can I just go back to, is there still a question on whether dry dredge would be possible here?
I don't know. What's the difference?
Dry dredging is done, if you are able to fully, get the water out of the system, then you can bring equipment physically into the basin and just dredge in the dry, basically.
Oh, I
But
understand now what you're saying.
yeah, but
That's a
we
lot.
did have that looked at in the dredging feasibility study, and it was not something that was determined to be feasible, which is why we went with the hydraulic.
I would think that the diversion of the water would be extremely expensive by itself to be able to create the conditions to do it. Plus, you don't know, I mean, those areas you're looking at, you're talking about also getting rights away from people's properties to be able to bring in the equipment necessary.
Yeah, there's a public access point at the boat launch, so I think you could probably get all of it in through there. But then with the drawdown capabilities of the dam, and then there may be ways to just keep the water levels pretty low. But I guess I am wondering, just as a general thought, is the town does have heavy equipment, dozers and that sort of thing. Is there any potential to have town employees get involved with doing something like a dry dredge using town equipment and doesn't have to go out to bid? And
That's what they did in Acton. I think Tom Tidman did the dredging of Ice House Pond in Acton 20-something years ago. But that is not a question that I can answer with certainty. That is a question for the Public Works Director. I can guess what his response is going to be.
Me too.
Was a thought.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. I mean, one, I don't think a dry dredge is feasible. Even with a full, complete drawdown, I don't think you can accomplish enough dry condition in that pond system to get equipment in there without sinking.
A lot of matting. You would need a lot of matting to get heavy equipment in there.
A lot.
You have that look like it'd be fun to watch, though.
I'd volunteer my time. I'd get out there in a dozer and
Oh,
Christine, one last question. Earlier on, you pointed to Commonwealth Avenue and you asked about that, and that's sort of the kind of the recreational appendage of the dredge plant. Should our proposal include those recreational appendages as well, or should we just stick to dredging?
I think that we should have the dredging cost, and then perhaps we should also have a cost of what it would be like to redo that boat launch area or the Commonwealth Ave area. Because it's kind of a mess. I
Yeah,
mean, you can't even really launch a canoe there without, walking in through the water and pushing it through, and even at the
Yeah.
best of times.
we did have, that was part of the dredging bid,
Right.
was to improve that boat launch. Make it ADA accessible, make it, get some invasives removal, get better, sort of more dedicated parking there, and, just improve it. There was a number of aspects to that plan. I don't remember them all, but they're in the permit set. Do you want me to pull them up? Is that helpful to look at that?
I think that's a good idea. As I recall, the price wasn't huge.
Yeah.
No, it's a couple $100,000, I think, in there.
Yeah.
So I think, I I think the access from Giroux might also be considered as well.
Yes, I agree with that as well.
What
Yeah,
did you say,
that,
Paul?
I'm saying the access, the boat access from Giroux.
Yeah.
As a, as a, part of the proposal.
Mhm. Because that's what we're also trying to promote here is access to the pond.
Yeah.
I've been wondering, is there any reason why we couldn't put out the bid right now, just improving the boat launch and not link it to dredging? I mean, we kind of had a bid on that. We know what it costs. Could we use the permit to improve the boat launch and ComAp right now?
Good
Thing we could-
question.
We could think about.
Do you have a
Right.
that?
What's that, Jeff?
Do you have a design for that already?
We do. So just pull this up here. So this is what had been initially proposed. So this is the road. It was gonna be like a little pull-out area here so that two cars could theoretically pass. And on both sides was invasives removal. There was some stormwater improvements with this grass channel. That accessible parking and some improved canoe launch area. So that plan exists.
Yeah, I have two comments then. One, I'm not sure the CPC money could be used just for the boat launch. Number two, if the option ends up being dam removal and not dredging, and we can't prejudge that, then what you're seeing here might have to be rethought.
Good points.
So
Hmm,
many of
yeah. But I still think you're right, though, Paul, that that's something that we should definitely consider, including that or having it as an aside, as well as something for Giroux. Was there ever a plan to, a more specific plan at Giroux, do you know? For,
Not that, I mean, it's not conservation land, so it wouldn't be something that my office prepared or had prepared. But when Kate Hodges was here and she had her phase 1 and phase 2, the phase 2 did include, and we talked about this, during the permitting process for phase 1, there was a boat launch with, like an L-shaped boat launch with a fishing platform that had been considered and, is
it's
pretty
actually
easy permitting.
it's actually some of the drawings and
right,
Christine, there's conversation right now about whether that is going to be proposed or not this year, and I don't want to jump too far ahead. It's not there's so much going on with Giroux right now. It's a whole nother conversation.
right. All right. Well, then we'll just keep it in mind then. And maybe
Well,
not.
I think it wouldn't be bad to propose it, because that's what we're doing, but I'm just saying it's not in the the design is not as advanced as the Commonwealth Avenue, Commonwealth Road
Right.
pieces. But it's in the plan, it's an A plan.
So as an aside, Paul, on that, you know how they're saying, or I'm hearing that phase 1 is what they're working on right now. So is that in phase 2 of Giroux, do you know?
Yeah, well, if you talk to the town manager, there is no phase 2 right now. They want to finish Giroux and that's it. And then what comes next is not any plan right now. There's not phase 2. There's no formal phase 2 that anybody in the town will own up to. Although it wasn't Kate Hodges' original plan when
Yeah.
Giroux was purchased, so it's a more complicated conversation, Christine, believe me.
Okay, I do believe you. I really do.
I know, I have scars. Well, actually, not, I'm still bleeding. The scars come later.
Well, we'll have to talk more about that then, Paul.
Yes, we will.
So I'm curious on how, so at the next meeting, at the next full meeting, are we all reporting back something from each of the committees of what we did, what we talked about? And then who's gonna put that together? Because that's gonna be somebody's responsibility.
So we don't need to report out on this meeting. We'll have the minutes from this. The report out just needs to be a sentence or two, and any volunteers, go for it. But it just needs to be enough so that what conversation we are having in that task force meeting can be captured in the larger task force minutes.
It's really just updating them on what we have just talked about.
Right.
You know, our plan is to, figure out the volume of the dredge area. What does,
Fast.
what,
Getting along. Not Chris, but Delia's Harry.
oops. I think to figure out the volume of the dredge area. What will it look like on that particular land? Like how high will it be on the dredge area? We're looking to get a price for 35,000 yards to dredge. It will be hydraulic dredging. And that's kind of it for right now. And we've talked about access to the ComAv area, but that's not. We need to understand if we're going to be doing dredging or dam removal. Does that make sense?
I think you have to add that the first 35,000 sort of I'll call it minimal base case, just that we would like to figure out how to dredge more, but it depends on, A, where to dispose, and B, what the costs are. So we have to wait to see how ambitious we can get.
Right, okay. Well, I guess I'll do the summary then at the meeting, huh?
You did a heck of a job just now. I was thinking the same thing.
Okay,
And
All
I'll
right,
send
I'm
draft
happy to do
minutes
that.
around before the meeting on the 13th.
say that one more time.
I will send these draft minutes around before our meeting on the 13th.
Okay. And I guess I do have one last question. What is our, so Delia, you will let us know then as you find out this information, you'll let us know maybe some of it at the next meeting or whenever you get it. I don't know when that will be.
For sure. You mean in terms of how we get this information and what we're yeah, I hope to have an update for you at our next meeting, which will be within this task force meeting next week.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
Sounds good to me. What about all you guys?
Sounds good.
Yeah, agreed. It's a good start.
Okay. So then I guess we need to open it up to public comments. Any hands raised? Yes, Jill. I'm sorry, not Jill.
Denise,
Denise, well, Denise, I'm
Well,
sorry.
I came here mostly to learn, and I've learned a great deal.
Denise, would you mind just giving us your address for the record, please?
5 Concord Green,
Thank you.
and I appreciate everything I've heard and what I've learned. I guess on my mind are systems, ecosystems, and economic systems, because they're entwined with all of this. But to get directly to my question and talking about ancillary things that need to be done, I felt that what's missing from my perspective right now is any discussion of the dam. Because according to what I know, there was initially going to be some tending of the dam, and that has been missing, that the town has not been tending to the dam and fish passageway. So I just thought that when in the discussion of dredging, it's to keep in mind that as we look forward, isn't that dam very, very important as we look into the future of the health of the ecosystem? That was my question.
Thank you. Yes, we appreciate that. And that's definitely things that we can put on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Alyssa.
I know you guys talked about the use of that area, the prison area, for disposal of the sediment in terms of the timing of it in respect to the Route 2. But just putting on my citizen of Concord hat, my feeling, my gut reaction was that that putting stuff there when there's such a interest in the Route 2 rotary improvements, that I think the reaction of the town at town meeting would be, what? You're going to spend all this money to put stuff on the ground that we then have to remove for Route 2 and will get in the way. And it's just, it's the kind of thing that I just think would get people up in arms in terms of wasting money. Didn't we think ahead? So that's my main point. As a minor point, I would say that we put in at least 2 or 3 canoe kayaks at the Commonwealth launch just yesterday or 2 days ago, and it was so much better than most launches I use. The water level being low, it's not mucky at all. It was quite sandy by the time you put it in. So from my perspective, looking at a lot of the put-ins and landings in the Concord area, Commonwealth Ave was better than most.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for those comments. Appreciate it.
Alyssa, your address, please.
5 Concord Green.
Thank you, Alyssa. Anna.
Thank you. 343 Commonwealth Avenue, Anna Feldwick. I was actually going to say the opposite of what Alyssa just said, which is that, the boat launch is the one place that people can access the pond easily. And $14,000 to make it nicer is, in my mind, a very reasonable price, considering some of the things we spend money on, like the bench at the MCI cemetery for 30,000+, for example. And it seems to me like there's only 1/3 chance we'll be taking the dam down and a 2/3 chance we'll be leaving it in. So I would vote for doing that one small thing that would actually have quite a big impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Alyssa, your hand is still up.
Yeah, if I could say one more thing, I forgot. Actually, I think as they do the Route 2 redesign, I think they'll be looking for an area to do stormwater improvements, and that land that you're talking about is one that could be very well used in the future. And actually, I think it could be very well used right now for stormwater improvements. There is that 30-inch storm drain that goes directly from Route 2 to the pond, and using some of that area for stormwater treatment prior to its being discharged directly into the pond would be a much more valuable use of at least a portion of that land.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Appreciate
There's
it.
so much land.
Anybody, any other comments? Okay, then I guess we will close the meeting. Thank you so much for everybody attending.
Thank you.
Everybody,
All right. Bye-bye.
see you next week.